Welcome to the PIO Podcast, a place for everything public information related for police, fire, EMS, and local governments.
It was a good learning experience for a lot of us that social media is not real life.
But we have to remember the media are very rarely a target audience. They're simply that conduit.
Our words have impacts on individuals, and it may not be positive. So just being thoughtful and mindful of the words that we speak.
I think what's so interesting about this position too, and this job and this profession, is that every one of us is looking for purpose, and when we find it here, that's it.
To know is that a crisis for one is not necessarily a crisis for another.
Hey everybody, just wanted to get on here real quick and ask everybody if they enjoyed our content, if they've listened to us, if they want to keep us going, to help support the show. And you can do that by going down to the bottom of the show notes of today's episode and clicking the link and giving us a sponsorship or even just a one-time donation. That'll really help us keep this podcast going and keep us giving you new content. Thanks everybody. Enjoy today's episode. Good afternoon. Today on the PIO Podcast, we have Sergeant Michael Sugrue. He's a retired sergeant from the city of Walnut Creek Police Department in California. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Michael, give our listeners your law enforcement background since you're retired. Go through that, and then we'll go into today's discussion.
For me, actually, my interest in law enforcement goes all the way back to childhood. I come from a law enforcement family. My stepfather was also a police officer here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Was a police volunteer at 8 years old, a police explorer in high school. Went to California State University on a scholarship through the Air Force. And I got commissioned in 1998 as a security forces officer, which is basically law enforcement, anti-terrorism, force protection, air-based ground defense. Served 6.5 years honorably all over the world, from Europe, Middle East, South America, all over the U.S. I got out as a captain, and I went straight into civilian law enforcement for the Walnut Creek Police Department in 2004. I served as a patrol officer, a field training officer, a detective. I was undercover 2 years on a California State Drug Task Force, eventually promoted to sergeant, where I was running teams on the streets, and I was also a driver instructor and a PIO.
Okay. So you've done a lot. You've seen a lot. You've experienced a lot. And what we're talking about today is part of that is the trauma that people go through. So, Michael, you experienced a significant trauma in an incident while you were working at your department. If you feel comfortable, would you care to talk about it?
Yeah, so to put things in perspective, I was promoted to sergeant back in November of 2012. I had about 8 years on at Walnut Creek. Went through an informal training process where you kind of ride around with other sergeants. Now, fast forward a month later, I was actually running my second solo shift. My shift started, it was a graveyard shift, so it started on December 26th at 9:30 at night and was supposed to get off at 7:30 in the morning the next day. A quiet shift, minimum staffing, not much going on. Lieutenant went home around 1 a.m., and at that point, I was the only supervisor on duty for the entire city. A few hours from going off duty, I was reviewing reports, and suddenly our female dispatcher, the only dispatcher we had on duty at that time, comes on the air. Her voice is very frantic, and she puts out the address on Creekside Drive and says that there is a woman inside a condominium and a man armed with a knife. So immediately I start driving as fast as I can to that location. Every single officer on duty is answering up on the radio. I can hear them, so they're en route. About halfway there, the dispatcher gets back on the radio and says, now the boyfriend and girlfriend are barricaded inside their bedroom. And I was confused, so I actually asked for clarification over the radio and asked, is the boyfriend the one with the knife, or is there a third subject armed with a knife? And the dispatcher quickly clarified, no, there's a third party armed with a knife. And so at this point, I mean, thoughts are just racing through my head. You know, I'm brand new supervisor. This call starts out very unusual from the very beginning. I know this area, I know the complex, but I don't know where this exact unit is. It's a bunch of 2-story attached condominiums with multiple rows and like a courtyard in the center of it. So I arrive first on scene in just a matter of a couple minutes. And as I start to get out of my car, the dispatcher starts screaming on the radio saying, units, there's a struggle. And then she loses all phone communication inside with the female caller. At that same time, thank goodness, one of my officers, a female officer, pulls up right behind me. And we can hear blood-curdling screams coming from the distance. It sounds pretty far away, but just horrible screams, like somebody screaming for their life. And her and I, we pull out our guns, we look at each other, and we just start running towards the sound of the screams. Eventually, we have to crawl underneath an outside stairwell, and it puts us into this open courtyard, and we find the unit, and it goes from literally blood-curdling screams to just eerie silence. Like, I don't remember seeing anybody else outside. I don't remember hearing any noises at that point. And it's just her and I at this unit. I know I've got more officers coming, but we got to get inside there. So I go to the front door. My partner posts up at a nearby window. We announce ourselves multiple times. Nothing, don't hear anything. I eventually try kicking open the front door. It doesn't work. And my partner motions to the window she's at. It's a huge window. It's a louvered window the size of a door. And it's completely shattered into the condominium. And so now I join her at this window on the opposite side, and we're giving commands again, nothing. She looks at me. I look at her. She goes right in. I follow her. That puts us into a kitchen area immediately, just glass everywhere, drawers open. We exit the kitchen. She goes right, and that puts her at the base of a stairwell, and the locked front door is to her back. I go left down the hallway. That leads me to like a family room, living room area. I clear that. I don't find anybody. There's no signs of disturbance or a struggle other than what we saw in that kitchen. I then join my partner at the base of the stairwell. And now literally we are shoulder to shoulder. I can feel her shoulder to my right. To her right is a solid wall. And then we're looking up this dark staircase. And we can see an opening on the top left. We don't know if it's a landing, a bedroom, but we know there's something there. And so her and I, we have our guns out, we have mounted lights, they're on, and we're yelling up the stairwell saying, police, come out, show us your hands, show us your hands. Moments later, a male subject partially comes out at the top of the stairs. We can't see the entire right side of his body, including his right hand and his right arm. Just sweating profusely, eyes wide open, literally just staring straight through us. And we're giving multiple commands to show us your hands, show us your hands. I don't remember any reaction, no eyes blinking, no body movement, no facial expressions. Again, just staring straight through us. At some point, 2 more officers come into the condominium, and I yell for one of them to get the taser, less lethal force. And there's another male officer and a female officer. The male officer says he's got the taser. He positions directly behind myself and that first officer at the bottom of that staircase. The last officer goes perpendicular to the staircase, gun out. She can't see all the way to the top of the staircase. She can only see about 3/4 up. Moments later, the male comes fully out. My partner yells, he's got a knife, he's got a knife. And sure enough, in his right hand, he was clenching a full-size kitchen knife, like a butcher knife, huge knife. And now, we're yelling, drop the knife, drop the knife. Again, no reaction. And this all seems like a long time, but this is really happening in a matter of seconds. This happens very quick. Moments later, the subject takes the knife up over his head in a stabbing position, starts coming down the staircase towards us. I shoot. Other people shoot. The officer tries to deploy the taser. At that point, I'm not sure if I've hit him. I'm not sure if anybody's hit him. He is now at the base of the staircase. I don't see any injuries. I don't see blood. 2 of the officers relocated to the family room area. And that male officer had the taser. He dropped the taser, pulled out his firearm, and he and I are literally just a few feet from the subject, still clenching this huge knife. And all we know is he's between us and the couple upstairs. And we don't know if they're dying, if they're bleeding. We don't know their status, but we've got to get to them. And so now myself and the one officer, again, are yelling at him, drop the knife, drop the knife. He starts coming back up with the knife. I mean, literally right there in front of us. I fired, my partner fired, and his wounds were devastating. His eye was gone, blood was everywhere. I had the officer check vitals. There were none. We already had medical staging. I radioed dispatch to send in medical. We checked on the couple upstairs, and thank God we got there when we did, because this subject had literally been stabbing through their bedroom door, and they were physically barricading their body against that door as it was coming off the hinges. And I know today, had we not gotten there when we did, I have no doubt they would have been killed. No doubt. But that incident, I call it my tipping point, my breaking point, because up to that point, I had been exposed to hundreds and hundreds of traumatic incidents, like all first responders. It's what we do. It's what we see. And like most first responders, I never processed it. I never talked about it. I just let it bottle up inside, thinking it wouldn't hurt me. It would just go away. And this incident, in literally a millisecond, took away that feeling of invincibility that I always had in both the military and 8 years in law enforcement. I'm literally like almost 15 years of just complete invincibility, doing high risk entries nonstop as an undercover task force agent. But this incident forever changed me.
Wow. Wow. I'm assuming the person had to be on something. I'm sure you guys found that out later.
Let's take a quick break.
When you think about propaganda, you probably think about Kim Jong-un and his funny little haircut. And you'd be exactly right. The podcast, This Is Propaganda, doesn't want you to believe that. They want you to question the ads you see, the news you read, the brands you love. What they don't want you to question is that they are advertisers themselves, peddling the same tricks they claim you fall for to make a living. If you need something to boycott, look no further than this show. Don't listen to This Is Propaganda.
So we don't know the ins and outs. What we do know is that he had THC in his system, so he definitely used marijuana. His roommates and friends in later interviews said that he had used ecstasy or MDMA in the last couple weeks. His roommate said he was like smoking sage or doing something that night in the apartment. And so, we sent his blood off to not just our county laboratory, but to private laboratories across the country. And back then, again, this is 2012, there's tons of designer drugs that were out that weren't detectable at the time by standard labs. And so we don't know. One thought is that this guy had a drug-induced psychosis, which, believe it or not, marijuana can actually cause that, and so can other drugs. But this individual had no history whatsoever of mental illness, of mental health problems. In fact, he was very well liked, very well respected. It turned out that he actually was one of the roommates that lived in that condominium, and he was friends with these people. They were hanging out hours earlier in the night, and nothing unusual happened. They had no fights, no arguments. And so, again, we don't know if it was a psychotic break, drug-induced psychosis, but that's part of what makes this situation so difficult for me, is that up until that moment, he really was a good young man who was living a normal life. And even to this day, we got sued immediately. I endured a 4-year federal lawsuit. I went to trial in San Francisco in federal court, 2-week trial. Thank God we prevailed, we won. But even today now, 12 years later, we don't have the answers as to why this man did what he did. And that will always stick with me.
So, Michael, departments in the past were never really good at handling the trauma that officers handled. They've gotten much better in the recent years. But back in 2012, I can't imagine your department was really prepared for what you dealt with. How did they handle what you guys and the girl had to go through?
So, our department was actually very progressive at that point and very advanced. We had full peer support teams. We had a contracted, culturally competent clinician that worked with the department, a great clinician. We had, training like once a year. But the fact is that nobody used those resources. Nobody believed in them, including myself. Most people at that time on peer support were kind of like the nice, likable people, but they weren't really the cops who had been out there and done it. And, it was kind of like that environment where you just couldn't trust it. You thought that if I talk to anybody within my agency about this stuff, it's going to spread like wildfire. But one thing that my agency did that was good is we all were put off work. We were off for 2 weeks. About a week after the shooting, we had an IA interview. We had the protocol interview the morning of, And then after the IA interviews, they actually brought in that culturally competent clinician. We had a critical incident debrief with the dispatcher. There was 4 officers, including myself. And again, this is a mistake I made because in that critical incident debrief, we all were just on a fact-finding mission because we'd been ordered not to talk to each other. We didn't know what other people saw and what they did. We only know what we did. And so as an example, like on that second volley of shots, the whole time up to that point, I thought it was that same female officer that arrived on scene with me who was involved in the second volley of shots. I didn't learn until the critical incident debrief that it was actually the male officer with the taser. And people don't realize that when these incidents happen, you have super hyper focused vision, selective hearing. And in this case, we're so, targeted on that knife and on the threat, you're not really aware of what other people around you are doing. And I also remember that, and people need to understand that like with post-traumatic stress injury, some things happen like pretty early on, but a lot of this is gradual and progressive. And so for me, I immediately felt detached. I felt numb. I started having nightmares, but I also just wanted to go back to work as quick as I could. And that's how the other officers felt because
that's the way we were taught to do. We just go back out on the street. We got to get back to work. That's just the way the nature of law enforcement's always been that way. It's not like the fire department when they have stuff. They do that medical debrief and they have their downtime, and it's a lot different for them as opposed to us. I remember when in my department, we went through a series of very tragic things. We had a line of duty death. We had 2 suicides within 10 years. That trauma took a toll on it. It actually broke our department. A lot of people had a lot of post-traumatic stress from that. And I will say our department did a really profound thing. They had mandatory sessions with therapists, and they brought therapists in, and we all had to go to them and continue to go to them. And some of us to this day still go to them. So, but that trauma still sticks with you, and you can't just go back to work and let it happen. So obviously since you didn't process it right, obviously, because you just didn't know how to process it, what was the side effects of that? What did it do to your family relationship, your work relationship? What happened there?
Again, I made a lot of mistakes, and I talk about these in my book and when I speak across the country. But one of the biggest mistakes I made when I was actually in the police academy is that I told myself I would never bring work home. I would never talk about the job. And in that sense, I thought I was protecting my family. I was married at the time, beautiful daughter. And so up to that point, when the shooting happened, I had never talked about the suicides, the horrific car accidents, the homicides, the domestic violence, the child abuse. All the things that we see day in and day out. I would just come home pissed off and in a bad mood. And my wife at the time would have to walk around on eggshells around me because she thought it was her and didn't realize it was the horrible day I was having. And this is where I encourage people to not make that mistake, to start that communication now. And don't share graphic, gory details, but when something happens, just express and say, look, I had a really tough day today. Here's what happened. I just need some time to decompress. Here, I'm going to go work out, or I'm going to go for a walk. But when I get back, we can sit down, we can talk about it. But I didn't establish that. And so when this happened, I didn't talk to my wife about it. I didn't lean on her, and I didn't have anybody I could talk to that I trusted. We were ordered not to talk about it because of the protocol interview, the IA interview, and obviously the federal lawsuit now. But there was protected communication that I could have used, like therapists, clinicians, priests, even my wife. That's protected communication. But again, I didn't use those resources. I didn't believe in them. So what I did was I let it bottle up. I started having constant nightmares. I started drinking more, trying to drink myself to sleep, hoping I could just pass out. But the nightmares didn't go away. They were still there. Then I would wake up the next day hungover, feeling horrible. And it was just this vicious cycle where I literally didn't want to be around anyone. I just wanted to isolate. And so I didn't want to go to family functions anymore. I didn't want to go out with friends. I literally wanted to stay home in my room and just be by myself. When I was at work for a long time, I was operational. And many of us are good at when we put that uniform on and badge, we can actually go to work, we can show up, we can be productive, get the job done, and we could still be falling apart inside. But at home, literally everything was falling apart. And it got to the point where now my marriage is done. Now I'm fighting for custody of my beautiful daughter, who was only 2.5 years old when the shooting happened. And I started having major health issues. My stepfather, my hero I talked about in the beginning of this interview, he got diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer at 58. He died a few months later. Literally everything in my world was crashing down. And it got so bad, it got to the point where I didn't want to be here anymore. I purposely started putting myself in dangerous situations, hoping to get killed in the line of duty. That's how bad it got.
All right, so hold that thought. You brought up in your book that you had a betrayal of administration in helping you address the trauma. How did their reactions to your testimony during the coroner's inquest impact you emotionally and professionally?
This was a pivotal point. So in our county, anytime law enforcement is involved in a death, so it could be like a jail setting where somebody hangs himself, a suicide by cop, a car chase that ends in a fatality. They have a public hearing. There's a judge, a full jury. And in this case, I believe they had it in August of 2013. So months later, there was a judge there, again, jury. I brought my wife at the time because I wanted her to hear what happened. There was reporters there. Family members of the person I killed was literally sitting feet from me, the parents, the grandparents. Turns out this guy had an identical twin brother that looked just like him. So this face that I couldn't get out of my nightmares is literally like right in front of me. And so I remember we were in the courtroom and they played the dispatch tapes for the first time. And I literally felt like I was going to pass out. I started sweating. My heart started racing. Like I was literally back at that night, back at that condominium. And the judge had me get up on the stand and testify. And the jury's literally like only a couple feet from me. And I'm doing good at first. And I get to the point where he's coming down the stairs with that knife and I just lose it. I literally start bawling like a baby in this packed courtroom. There's like over 60 people. And I was so embarrassed. I mean, I've never shown emotion like that to anybody, and certainly not in a packed courtroom. And when I was done, the judge said, "Hey, thank you, Sergeant. We have what you need. You're excused." I literally ran out of that courtroom, ran to the bathroom, was like splashing water in my face, telling myself, get your shit together, get back in there. I did. My officers did great. A couple weeks later, we got the finding that we wanted. We got the best possible finding you could get in this coroner's inquest. And I remember at the time, I was feeling good in that regard because there hadn't been an officer-involved shooting like 12 or 10 years earlier. So the entire time I was at that agency, there hadn't been an officer-involved shooting. And in this case, we saved the lives of the couple. We saved the lives of our officers. None of us were hurt physically. And now we had this hearing. We got this great finding. And I remember the lieutenant came by and said, "Hey, the captain wants to see you in his office." And I was thinking, oh, this is going to be good. I'm going to get accolades. I'm still on probation. And so I go in there and there's a captain and somebody else. And I could tell right away this was not a friendly meeting. And they say, "Sergeant, close the door." I sit down in the chair. And I'm a former military guy. So I'm sitting straight up, heels together, hands on my lap. And I'm sitting there listening. And it was like, back then, if you outranked me, it was yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. There was never questioning. There was never talking back to authority. And a couple things happened in that room. The first thing that happened was they questioned the genuineness of my emotions that I showed during that coroner's inquest, both indirectly and directly. And they said they thought I was acting or putting on a show for the jury. And I could not believe it. I mean, here I am embarrassed and ashamed already, hoping that nobody was going to remember that. And now my own leadership is now calling my very integrity into question. And up to this point, my career was off the charts in both the military and civilian law enforcement. I mean, I was on the fast track. I wanted to be chief of police someday. And I remember the second thing that happened was my leadership ability got called into question. And the last thing that happened, and now I want you to understand something. So in between the shooting and this coroner's inquest, the chief that was there had retired. So that chief promoted me. I liked him. We had a great relationship. He was there for me during the shooting, but he had left. And now we had this outsider chief who had come from another agency. He didn't know me. He decided that he was going to extend my probation as a sergeant, put my promotion in jeopardy, which I'd never heard of at that point. I've heard officers of having their probation extended, but never a sergeant. And I remember just feeling like I was so angry, but I didn't express that. And this is where I should have asked for help. This is where I should have had the strength and courage to let them know what was going on in my life. But I didn't have that trust with them. I mean, here I feel like they're turning their back on me. You know, they're not supporting me. So why on earth am I going to open up to them in this room when I feel like I'm being attacked?
Was your relationship with your wife falling apart already at this point?
It was. It started falling apart in February. So the shooting happened December 27th, 2012. And so mid-February 2013, things are starting to go. We're not getting divorced yet. We're not separated yet. And then that coroner's inquest, you know, we were starting to have some major problems at that point. And I was hoping that with her being there, she would see how traumatic this event was and what a toll it was taking on me. But, you know, she didn't know how to react. I mean, because she wasn't used to talking to me like that or expressing those kinds of feelings. And we didn't have that healthy, established communication in our relationship. And that's why I tell people is like, hey, if you don't have that now, start today. It's never too late to start. Don't wait for the big incident. Don't wait for that tipping point because it might be too late.
And now, a word from our sponsor. In today's climate, you need to be able to communicate, whether you're communicating to those you serve, your peers, or your constituents. Whether you're looking for professional development or to work with a professional, John Guilfoyle Public Relations has you covered. From crisis communications to website development, visit our website at jgpr.net or call us directly at 617-993-0003 to get started today. We'll help you tell your story strategically. Now let's return back to our episode.
So, Michael, what happened? What was the outcome of that interview with them? Your probation's extended. Now what happens? And they've called you. They basically called your entire integrity into question without any real basis for it, and not thinking about the mental stress and impact that incident had on you, and what leakage it could cause.
Yeah, honestly, I felt like I was on an island, and I made a conscious decision that I would never show emotion again. I would never express feelings because that was weakness. That was shameful. And I became a real asshole, honestly. I became unapproachable. My subordinates didn't want to come to me and talk to me, and I lost all sight of empathy and sympathy because I felt like I had to overcompensate and put up this exterior front that I'm just this badass who doesn't give a shit about anything. And it translated into failure in my role as a sergeant.
And at what point did you make the decision, okay, I can't stay here anymore. I've got to move on. What was that? Explain how that occurred.
So the trial actually went September of 2016. It ended mid September 2016. And I always told myself that when the trial was over, as long as we won, as long as we prevailed, all my problems would magically go away. And that wasn't the case. They actually got much, much worse because I had to sit there as a defendant in court for 2 weeks hearing all these crazy expert witnesses that they hired who were saying we were cold-blooded murderers, we planted evidence, this guy was never armed. You know, they're putting these crazy articles out in the newspaper. And again, all those family members I talked about are sitting feet behind me in the courtroom. And I'm seeing them in the hallways and during lunch on the breaks in the courthouse, and that identical twin brother. So now the nightmares I'm having for 4 years still is literally feet behind me in the courtroom. And so when that trial ended, again, things got much, much worse. And that's where I was putting myself in those dangerous situations, putting my officer safety, my tactics, my good judgment aside, hoping for suicide by a bad guy. And so a couple months after that, a week after Thanksgiving 2016, I was on work. I was the day shift patrol sergeant getting ready to go home. And a call comes out of a suicide in progress. Turns out it's one of my best friends, John Davison. He was a Vietnam veteran. He was also a 35-year reserve officer with my department, and we rode together for many years. And I had no idea what he was going through or that he was struggling like that. And I remember just feeling this overwhelming sense of guilt. And I got to the ER just as they brought him in covered in blood. He had slit both wrists, stabbed himself in the torso, OD'd on multiple prescription medications. And I remember literally having 30 seconds with him before they rushed him off to surgery. Looking him in his eyes, he was in and out of consciousness. I just told him, John, you're going to make it. You're going to pull through this. And I remember sitting for hours in that hospital just wondering, like, why didn't I see the signs? Like, I started blaming myself, and all I could think about was my young daughter, who at this point is 6.5 years old. And all I thought about was, what's going to be the effect on her if I'm not here anymore? And a month after that, on the anniversary of my shooting, and thank God my friend survived, but he saved my life by trying to take his own life. And it was a month after that, on the anniversary of my shooting, so December 27th, 2016, I finally got the strength and courage to pull out my phone. I called the on-duty watch commander, and I just said, look, I can't do this anymore. I need help. And that phone call saved my life.
Wow, Michael, just unbelievable. I'm getting chills here listening to tell this story. So you bring your story up. You tell this on-duty supervisor that I'm out. What happens from that point?
So initially, my agency was very supportive. I got put off work. I got linked with an outside culturally competent therapist, somebody who was phenomenal. I started going to first responder support meetings that I learned about. I went through a program called the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat. I'm a peer volunteer now. But all these things were really changing my life in a positive way, and I was making progress. And about 6 months into my recovery, I got a phone call from one of my captains. I was down at Disneyland with my daughter on Father's Day weekend, and he was calling supposedly to check in on me. And so I'm telling him, all these great things I'm doing and the progress I'm making. And he asked me, was like, well, when do you think you'll be back to work? And I was like, well, sir, I don't have an exact date. I said, but I can tell you I am coming back. This is all I've ever wanted and known since being a child. And, I'm making great progress here, but I'm not ready right now. And that's where the conversation changed, and he started trying to talk me into retirement. And I was like, look, I don't have any plans to retire. And he's like, well, if you decide that you want to retire, we can make this painless and very easy and make it very quick for you. And I was like, I appreciate that, sir, but no, I plan to come back. And after that, it changed. That's where the administrative betrayal or the institutional betrayal started coming in. And I talk about this in great depths in my book. And this is the number one theme that's resonating with readers and listeners, because it turns out that we're all being screwed in some sense by our administrators, by our agencies, and it's much more common, much more rampant than we think. And it's what hurts us the most. When our blue family turns their back on us and leaves us out on an island when we need them most, this is what, in my opinion, causes most officers to commit suicide. And we haven't mentioned it here yet, but suicide is the number one killer of all first responders, and especially police officers. Suicides outnumber line of duty deaths every single year. And even the numbers we have, they're greatly underreported. The real numbers, I estimate, are 3 to 4 times higher. But that administrative betrayal is what actually, again, almost pushed me over the edge. And I finally came to the decision that I could no longer do this job, that I needed to medically retire. Well, here's the ironic thing. When I finally made that decision in August, a couple weeks later, on 9/11, I get a phone call from a captain saying that they're doing an IA investigation on me for something that supposedly happened a year and a half earlier. And I was facing all these 11 charges and policy violations and rule violations. And not only would it have cost me my retirement, but I could have been facing jail time, conviction. I mean, literally put all my integrity and everything into question. And so then I had to hire another lawyer, and this held up my retirement another 9 months. Eventually I was cleared on that. It was a bullshit investigation, but this is what I'm talking about. You go from a captain saying, hey, if you retire now, we're going to make this easy on you. We'll make it very quick and painless. And when I decide, well, no, I want to come back, and then it's not fast enough for them, then they decide, okay, you know what? We're not going to make this easy for you. We're going to actually try to push you over the edge and make you lose everything.
Yep, absolutely. Michael, you wrote a book, Relentless Courage, Winning the Battle Against Frontline Trauma. What can our officers, what can our colleagues out there in the world take from the book?
Yeah, so this book, I'm going to tell you right now, Relentless Courage, Winning the Battle Against Frontline Trauma. There is no other book like it. It's very, very unique format. So my co-author, Dr. Shauna Springer, she's a psychologist, culturally competent. She worked with the VA, with Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. She's worked with hundreds and hundreds of combat veterans and first responders. We did this book together. And what makes it so unique is that every chapter has two parts. The first part is my story told in my voice, all the way back to childhood until present day. But the second half of every chapter, Doc Springer comes in, she breaks everything down, explains it in very easy to understand terms, and shows, why these things are impacting us physically, mentally, the impacts on our family, on our loved ones, really showing the human side behind the badge and the uniform. And this book is not just for first responders. It's not just for military members. It's definitely for their loved ones and their family members, but this is also for everyone. This book will actually show the real people that we are, the true caring humans that we are behind the badge and the uniform, and the sacrifices that we make, literally putting our lives on the line every day for complete strangers. And this book was published, the hard copy came out April 2022. International bestseller, #1 for over 34 weeks, #1 in Canada and the US. It's saving relationships, it's saving careers, most importantly, it's saving lives. And last July, it hasn't been a year yet, but we went into the studio and recorded the Audible version in our own voices. And when I went into that studio, I relived every single event. And so when you listen to this Audible, it is chilling. You are actually there with me when this is happening. And so I'll be honest, I'm not much of a reader. It's hard for me to focus on books these days. I don't have that kind of time. But Audible, you can listen to it in the car. You can listen to it at the gym while you're working out. You can listen to the bathroom when you're getting ready. But I assure you, if anyone reads or listens to this, it will change your life as you know it.
Yep, absolutely. You know what? I've read it. It's a great book. And after reading it, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to get you on, because having gone through similar trauma with line of duty death and multiple suicides in my department, and understanding the stress that it puts on you and the stress it puts on relationships. Like I said, our department was broken after that. The relationship where people would go to people's houses and everybody would show up and they'd be a big party and all the wives would hang out. It all ended. The relationships, it all fractured off into little groups, and it was a very tough thing to see after being in a very family orientated environment. You brought up suicides, and I just wanted to throw a number out there that talked about the number of suicides that there's literally 12.5% of all surveyed police officers expressed a likelihood of a future suicide attempt. 12.5%. That's a really incredibly high number. And to just think about officers that don't get help, and like right now, Chicago's numbers are very high in suicide. There was just a recent one recently that occurred. And again, a couple of years ago, I think they had 17 in a year. I mean, just unbelievable. So I agree, this book and having this opportunity to read it, if it can save one life, it's worth every penny. It really is. I've always been a big believer of getting support from your fellow members, but sometimes you need the clinicians, the experts, and therapy was one of those things that definitely helped me in my relationship with my spouse and helped me and move on in life. So, I mean, I appreciate the fact that you did this and you continue this. You speak all over the country, correct?
I do. This is my purpose. This is my mission in life. I never planned on any of this. Honestly, I retired medically in 2018 from post-traumatic stress injury, and I just planned on living a quiet retirement life. And what changed it all was a year after that, a podcast host, somebody I didn't know, his name was Danny Bird. He's a former police officer. He asked me to be on his show. I didn't want to do it. And he kept bugging me, and he backed me into a corner in a good way. And I agreed to do it. And it was that single podcast episode that forever changed my life. It changed my path. When that thing aired, I was so worried. I was still so ashamed and embarrassed. I thought I was going to get like hateful messages and people looking down on me. But I started getting messages from all over the world, from Australia, Canada, the UK, all over the US. And people started sharing their stories with me. And they talked about how my story resonated with them, how different parts of my story was actually their story. And that just led to podcast after podcast, eventually led to speaking. And again, this book, I didn't plan on that. Doc Springer, I didn't know her. She reached out to me on LinkedIn right before COVID, just an intro phone call. And we hit it off and we decided to do this together. I mean, without even meeting her in person, COVID happened and we worked on this for over a year via Zoom until we actually got to meet in person. And so, I know that all this happened for a reason. And looking back now, as horrible as it was, I wouldn't change a single thing because it's led me here today. And I'm living proof to show people, look, you're not alone. You're not weak. All these feelings and things that you're going through, it's normal. It's a normal reaction for all the abnormal things that we have to see and deal with. And, together, Doc Springer and I, we show a pathway to healing. We show that it's possible to overcome post-traumatic stress injury. And I'm living a whole new life. I mean, my life today is better than it ever has been. So again, people listening and watching to this, know that you're not alone and know that it's not easy. There's good days and bad days. And my journey took a long time, but I promise you, if you ask for help and you put in the work, you will get better.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, from a standpoint of a public information officer that may do internal messaging to the officers, especially after a traumatic incident or talking to an employee assistance program, what internal messaging would be helpful for officers to hear it to remind them that they can reach out for help?
I think the important message would be to acknowledge really the human tragedy involved in these incidents. So when an incident occurs, whether, it's a really bad car accident, a mass casualty event, suicide, child death, whatever the case may be, but to really just acknowledge it, call it out. Like, this is horrible. Like, we shouldn't have to see or do things like this, but this is our job. This is our profession. So, emphasize that if this affects you, that's completely normal. But what's not normal, what's not good is keeping everything inside and not dealing with it. And so, hey, here's a bunch of outside confidential resources that you don't have to notify anybody within our agency, whether it's text lines, hotlines, even retreats put on by nonprofits that don't cost anything, or these first responder meetings that I told you about that are run by volunteers. They're not associated with an agency. And then also have a list of all the actual like EAP and department resources, whether it's the contracted therapists, the people who are on peer support, offer opportunities like West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat that I went through, but make it clear that we're here for you, okay? And this isn't just lip service, but we're here for you and we're going to get you whatever you need so you can come back even better than you were before. And that's the thing is that, I waited too long to ask for help. I waited 4 years suffering in silence. And I tell people all the time that the sooner you get help, the sooner you're going to get better, right? And if we can stress this to our leaders and our management that, hey, if we just help our people from the beginning, they're much more likely to work a full, healthy, successful career. But if we put them out on an island and we turn our backs on them, there's a good chance that either A, they're going to kill themselves, or B, they're going to leave this profession forever. And they have the power to make the difference in these people's lives.
And I truly think that the leadership in a lot of organizations has changed over the years, where they do understand that these resources are there, and getting the help to the officers that are in these traumatic incidents are priority to them. And I've seen that change in a lot of leaders that I've met in my career in the 4 or 5 departments I've worked for in my life. It's important to, to remind people that their job is to take care of the people below them. And, that's their primary duty. And if that's one of the best ways to do it, is to make sure that they're able to come back and be great officers in their department after something traumatic like that. Michael, is there a question I should have asked? And if so, how would you have answered it?
I don't think so. I think you've asked a bunch of great questions. The only thing I can think of is that if people want to reach out to me, I'm on pretty much every social media platform out there. You do have to type in the Sergeant space Michael Sugrue, Sugrue, but I'm on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, TikTok, Parler, Truth. I mean, you name it, I'm on it. And I check the messages daily. So if anybody does read or listen to Relentless Courage, I personally want to hear from you. I want to hear your thoughts on it. That's how accessible I am. I'm doing this to save lives. So again, reach out to me. If you're in crisis, you don't know where to start, I can help point you in the right direction. And one thing I didn't mention is that in the back of our book, we have an entire list of resources that have been vetted for first responders, military veterans. And again, many of these are confidential, they're private, and they don't cost a dime. So just know that there's endless resources out there. I truly had no idea until I started this journey, but endless resources out there to help you.
Michael, thank you very much, and I appreciate that. And I will add a bunch of those social media links in the show notes of the show so that people can find it, as well as a link to the Amazon thing for your book, so they can, if they want to purchase your book. Michael, thank you very much for being on the show. It's Michael Sugrue from Relentless Courage, winning the battle against frontline trauma. That's all for this week. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get notified on the latest episode. If you are listening on a platform that allows you to leave a review, please give us a review. Any review is appreciated. To support our efforts with the PIO podcast, you can click on the support button in the show notes, and any donation is appreciated. Thank you.